and welcome.
Mr. X began in the early 80s as a conceptual series of posters by graphic designer Dean Motter and the illustrator Paul Revochet. These posters, featuring a mysterious bald man, caught the attention of publisher Bill Marks, who asked Dean and Paul to produce a comic featuring this Mr. X character for Vortex Comics. Both Dean and Paul worked on the first issue of the comic for a year without producing an actual issue. Then Paul quit, presumably over creative differences with Dean, and that put the publisher in a position to find a team that could actually produce the comic, which had already been solicited for distribution. Bill Marks contacted and hired the Hernandez Brothers, who had just begun producing Love and Rockets, to write and draw the Mr. X comic. They agreed, and in June of 1984, after another series of delays, Mr. X finally hit comic book shelves. Thus began the rocky, highly irregular publishing schedule of Mr. X. Over the next year, the Hernandez brothers would only produce 4 issues of the supposedly bi-monthly series before quitting due to delayed payments. However, within those 4 issues, the character of Mr. X, his supporting cast, and the setting of Radiant City are firmly established. Presumably, these were all concepts taken from Dean Motter and elaborated upon by the Hernandez brothers. We meet the mysterious Mr. X, a man whose identity is flexible depending on who he's interacting with. He never sleeps, and he is always working to fix the flaws in the architecture of Radiant City. Radiant City was intended to be a utopia, built using the concept of psychotecture, a style of architecture that would influence the mood of the people living within its boundaries. Think feng shui on a massive scale. However, Radiant City was built by cheap and incompetent contractors, who got the work done by cutting corners, and that perverted the elaborate symmetry of the design. The result was a city that was, in essence, killing the people living in it. Mr. X struggles against those that exploit the flaws in Radiant City's design for their own selfish purposes. He's motivated by ego more than anything, since he was either entirely or partially responsible for the city's design. And Radiant City was supposed to be his crowning achievement, the ultimate expression of psychotecture, and he cannot rest until the city meets his exact original design. There's a definite Hernandez Brothers flavor to those first 4 issues. They contain all the charm and warmth that the brothers would be known for in the pages of Love and Rockets. There are rocket cars, futuristic settings populated by diverse crowds, emotionally questionable but good-hearted women, and men that seem focused on getting exactly what they want, despite the consequences. It's a story that is lighthearted but not breezy. It's, well, a solid 4-issue Hernandez Brothers story. Following the Hernandez brothers' departure, Dean Motter took over writing chores, and almost the entire remaining series would be illustrated by the newcomer, Seth. Over 8 issues, you really see his ability develop and become the streamlined, unique style he would use for Palookaville and other future projects. The series itself also begins to deviate from the tone established by the Hernandez brothers. It becomes deadly serious with noir overtones, and Mr. X's need to fix Radiant City becomes a pathological obsession. He also becomes less and less sympathetic as the series progresses. Mr. X has no problem misrepresenting his true identity. He takes excessive amounts of drugs, and he's so self-involved, he's barely conscious of the consequences to those around him. One could even argue that Mr. X's mission to fix Radiant City is actually making the situation worse. However, the series was cancelled at the 14th issue, and none of these established plot threads are ever resolved. The series was rebooted at Vortex Comics the following year as a black and white series with an entirely different creative team and a more abstract direction. Mr. X is given the opportunity to begin fixing Radiant City's problems, but he's being manipulated by others to cause a catastrophe that begins to burn the city down. This results in the population of the city becoming aware of Mr. X, and, in turn, they become openly hostile to his presence. Mr. X dies, meets God, and then is sent to hell, which just happens to be, you guessed it, Radiant City. Just like the first series, the second series ends at the 14th issue, without any resolution to Mr. X's identity or the problems with Radiant City. Although one could argue that Mr. X dying and ending up in the hell he was responsible for creating is a resolution. In fact, that might be what I'm suggesting here. Even though you get no answers to any of the questions either the first or second series asks, you do get a conclusion. It's vague, to be sure, but you are provided with an endpoint. In 1994, Vortex Comics closed down, and Mr. X moved over to Caliber Comics for a 4-issue miniseries in 1996. Following that, the character would lay dormant until 2008, when the creator, Dean Motter, rebooted the character for a series of miniseries at Dark Horse Comics. Despite being a mostly obscure comic during its original run, Mr. X is cited as being an influence on comics with a somewhat similar theme, the most notable of which is Transmetropolitan. I have to admit, I always thought the Spider Jerusalem character was basically Hunter S. Thompson, but after rereading Mr. X, I can see that Spider and Mr. X have some very similar character traits. For example, their excessive drug use. They both return to a city to right the wrongs of society, and both are single-minded, focused on a specific task despite the consequences. They are not direct copies of one another, but they do share some DNA. While many other comics have had unique or distinct locations, like Gotham or Metropolis, these have always been benevolent backgrounds, not an active ingredient in the stories that take place inside their boundaries. Furthermore, the people in, say, Gotham need protection from other people in Gotham, whereas in Radiant City, the people need protection from the architecture itself. It's an interesting take on the influence of environment on the behavior of the general population. One could even make the argument that those who oppose Mr. X are, subconsciously, agents for Radiant City itself. That is, the influence of the architecture compels them to maintain the city as it stands, rather than how it should be. In that respect, Radiant City is very Lovecraftian. The city is somewhat like the sleeping god Cthulhu, whose mere unconscious presence inspires madness and irrationality in anyone who feels it. But Radiant City isn't supernatural at all. It's a monument to science gone wrong. Overall, Mr. X is a good blend of science fiction and noir paranoia. Despite being published in the 80s, it doesn't feel outdated. In fact, 30 years later, it still has a futuristic feel to it.